And this $10 million barrier traps 99 out of 100 businesses in the United States. 99 out of 100. I mean, the odds are not good. But when you understand the fundamentals of what that barrier actually comprises, the odds get a whole lot better for you. You don't have to get rid of owner reliance all in one fell swoop. What you need to do is we need to have you incrementally increasing owner independence of the business. So one of the things that I've seen for businesses is when they move from where the owner is doing 70-80+% of the selling to having a true sales team that is doing 90+% or more of the selling. And that shift, it does a couple things. Number one, it now allows the business to be scalable, and that's a big deal. Number two, it actually makes the business much more valuable.
Maui Mastermind presents the Business Coach Podcast, answering your questions and providing real actionable insights for building a better, stronger, more profitable business without sacrificing your time, life, or freedom anymore.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Business Coach. I'm your host, David Finkel. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about a really important barrier inside of businesses as we scale, the $10 million barrier. Now, when you look at it, the numbers are pretty stark with that. So in the U.S., you've got about 32, 33 million businesses in total in the U.S. And of those, roughly 310,000 of them actually ever scale past 10 million in revenue, which it means that you've got about 1% of businesses are ever going to successfully scale past that $10 million barrier. So how do we do that? First of all, the best place to start usually is to start with the opposite. Not how do we scale there, but what stops businesses from scaling there is probably the best way to approach this initially. Having worked with as many businesses as I have, what I've learned is that rather than focusing on the goal we want, oftentimes the most important thing we can do is to ask ourselves, what stands in the way? What barrier stands in the way? And in this case, we'll call this the $10 million barrier. And this $10 million barrier traps 99 out of 100 businesses in the United States. 99 out of 100. I mean, the odds are not good. But when you understand the fundamentals of what that barrier actually comprises, the odds get a whole lot better for you. And that's what I want to go through in this episode of The Business Coach. So first of all, as we start off thinking about it, the first thing that stops a business owner from being that 1%, that 1 out of 100, is in fact, we'll call this controlitis. We'll call this a self-reliance. Now, you might have thought growing up, you've read different things, Ralph Waldo Emerson in school. Hey, self-reliance, David, that sounds pretty good. Isn't that a good thing? In this case, owner reliance or self-reliance, in the case of your business, we'll take the word self and make it owner reliance. Owner reliance is actually a trap. And if we put you at the center of the business and we scale around you, you will reach a point in time that business is now in a box. It is constrained. It no longer has the ability to grow past you. For most businesses, this is going to happen somewhere around about anywhere from 600,000-700,000 in revenue on the low end. And on the upper end, it's going to start happening somewhere around about $4 to $5 million per year in revenue. And so if we want to scale past not just these numbers, but to get ourselves comfortably, reliably past 10 million, we've got to deal with owner reliance. Now, owner reliance, the best thing I can share with you about that is it is not an all or nothing proposition. You don't have to get rid of owner reliance all in one fell swoop. What you need to do is we need to have you incrementally increasing owner independence of the business. So imagine you were a coaching client. Here's exactly how I'm going to have a sequence of how we're going to coach you through this part. So the first thing we're going to ask is, hey, as you look at your business, number one, what are the main vulnerabilities right now in terms of owner reliance? Where does it most hurt your business, or could it hurt your business? If you weren't there to produce some key result, how would it most hurt your business? You're going to brainstorm all the different possibilities that it might be. And you're also going to put a score 1 to 5 how costly, how expensive, how painful would it be if you weren't there to do this particular function? 5 is absolutely mission critical. The business could fail, really expensive, really painful. 1 is, you know what, we barely would miss it. And of all these different ones, you're going to find this quarter, you're going to pick, in step number 2, you're going to pick 1 or 2 vulnerabilities that you're going to deal with, and you're going to take and ask yourself, what 1 or 2 steps can you take to reduce each of these 1 or 2 vulnerabilities? Now let's do it with an example. I can remember the first time that I ever sat down to do this for my company, Maui Mastermind. And one of the things that I found for me as I put down here was payables is what came up first, right? How do I pay vendors? How do I pay team? How do I pay outside suppliers? So payables was a big deal. And we approached payables 2 different ways. Number 1, the first thing we did was we moved as much as we could onto credit cards. Not only did I enjoy the miles that I got or the points for my Amex cards or for the Capital One cards and cash back and so forth, but the big reason we did that was because we had good consumer protections there. It was a less risky way of dealing with it, because if there was a fraudulent charge, we could in fact initiate a chargeback, provided we stayed on top of the statements. Right? And the statements didn't have to be stayed on top of every 30 days. Even if I looked at it 60 days later, we would be okay in a pinch. Not best practice, but we could. The second part of payables was what I'll call the ACH process, right? How we paid through automated clearinghouse stuff. The online checks, so most payrolls are done for most of our clients this way. And in here, what we looked at was we had set up a 2-party system, 2 people involved in the flow of money. 1 set and initiated that. A second separate person, in this case it was me, was the final person sending out those ACHs. And it might be, at the time we started doing this, it might have been, $100,000, $120,000 in a period of time that we were sending out for that run of ACH payments. We would do them typically every couple of weeks. Sometimes we'd have special runs in there, but every 2 weeks. And so that was a big deal. So how do we work our way out of that? When we identified it, that was a big deal. If something happened to me, staff members wouldn't be getting paid. Outside suppliers wouldn't be getting paid. So how do we deal with that? The 2-party system. The first was we made sure we used credit cards for those expenses that we could, reducing risk there. The second way we did that was we found a second person to be the second approver of those 2-party ACHs. And that was a bit nerve-wracking at first when I first started switching to that. And I've talked with lots of clients through this movement. And what they found, for example, in this one was, oh my gosh, what's going to happen when Jody sees what other people are earning is almost always the big fear. Well, if you don't have at least one other person in your company who has the maturity, the competence, and the degree of trust that you have in that person to be able to play that second party on that ACH, then chances are you really actually need to hire better, or you need to develop people better, or some combination thereof, right? It should be something that you can do. It's more of a mental block in most cases with that part. So that's an example. So every quarter, you're going to look at your list of vulnerabilities and say, this quarter, what are the 1 or 2 vulnerabilities I want to do something about? I want to reduce reliance on me. I want to make the business have more, we call it strategic depth. And as I do that, generally speaking, what we're going to look to do is how do you replace yourself from a function at first. Later on, it could be strategic depth vulnerabilities, not just on you, the owner, but later on as you hit the 5 or the 15 or the $55 million level, like many of our clients, it's no longer so much it's a reliance on you, the owner. It might be reliance on certain department leaders or certain people on your leadership team. And in that case, the same thing applies. Again, we call it strategic depth. How do we build the company to be independent of any one or few people in the company, to have really strong, robust systems in place with good, well-trained, cross-trained team members who can back each other up, and a culture that says this is the norm inside of our company. As we do that every quarter, we simply ask, what can I do? What are the 1 or 2 things this quarter we can deal with to make, in this case, owner independence a little bit bigger? to get rid of some key owner reliance that we had before. Oftentimes it's in the payable side, or oftentimes it's in the sales side. One of the things that I've seen for businesses is when they move from where the owner is doing 70, 80+% of the selling to having a true sales team that is doing 90+% or more of the selling. And that shift, it does a couple things. Number one, it now allows the business to be scalable, and that's a big deal. Number two, it actually makes the business much more valuable. Not that you're looking to sell the business, but a business that has real deep owner independence, real deep strategic depth, oftentimes can command a multiple of profit that's 2, 3, 4 times greater than the same business with the same profit that has real owner concentration or owner reliance risks involved. And that makes sense if you were buying a company and you had company A that had wonderful strategic depth and it had, what we'll put it here, had $2 million of profit, and you had company B with $2 million of profit, but it wouldn't work at all for even 30 to 60 days without the owner there. The business would degrade and fail. You're going to pay a lot more for that $2 million of profit from company A with strategic depth than you ever would pay for company B that had such concentration or owner reliance issues. Forgetting the valuation though, it is really hard to scale to be one of these 1%ers scaling past $10 million if you still have deep owner reliance issues. So what we've said here is we start off by every quarter, we look at where our current reliance is, where are the vulnerabilities that we have to deal with, and what are 1 or 2 meaningful steps that we can do. Now at first it's just you, the owner, doing this. When you're a $700,000 business, that's you, the owner, doing it. But eventually you start looking at who are the other team members that are key team members, and you say, hey, Jody, I want you to pick one thing you can do this quarter to increase strategic depth in your area of the company. And Jody says, well, here I am, I'm the leader of operations, and what I realize is I need to cross-train 2 other team members to do this key function. And then eventually you have another team member who's involved with that. You have Carl, and you find Carl, hey, what are 1 or 2 steps you can take this quarter, Carl, that if you did these key steps would have the biggest difference this quarter to increase strategic depth for the company. And you do this quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter, and generally speaking, within 12, 24 months of starting and consistently doing this process, I'll speak for coaching clients that we work with, we see that they can increase strategic depth by 100%, by 200%, by 300%. So that if the strategic depth or the owner independence initially was a 2 out of 10 rating, we can get them up to 6 or even 8 out of 10, and typically can do that within 24 to 36 months. That's a very doable progress we see with coaching clients that we work with. It's a big deal. And now when you have that owner independence, eventually calling it strategic depth, right? When it's more than just you, the owner, but you've created independence of not just you, but depth beyond some of your key people. We've taken things that once upon a time only one person can do, and we've helped broaden them so that multiple people can do them following a best practice process using some internal tools that we've developed so that we don't have that reliance issue. And when I do that, now the business is much more scalable. So the first thing we need to do as we're looking at this to break that $10 million barrier is we need to deal with owner reliance. Another name for owner reliance is the self-employment trap. Really, the business owner doesn't have a business, they have a self-employed situation. And so what we do is we don't put you at the center, we put the business at the center and make things revolve around the business, which now means we can keep scaling, keep scaling, keep scaling. All right, second thing we need to deal with. The first thing that holds us back from that $10 million barrier, without doubt, is owner reliance. The second is complexity. And this is a strange one for most business owners. They don't really see that they do this, but what I commonly see clients do that are in the $3, $4, $5 million range in revenue, they come to us and we start working with them. We start to increase strategic depth. Their business starts to grow. They're now at 6 million or 7 million, but they now have hit another internal tripwire. And what they really need help observing for themselves and dealing with is that they've, in a myriad of different ways, made their business too complicated, too complex. I'll give an example for it. There's a client we coached, and they had a professional services firm, a consulting practice in technology. They were a data analytics company. And for them, each of the project engagements that they would do might be anywhere from $50,000 to $250,000 of the project size. But every project was a custom project. And their comment was, well, David, in the world we operate in, it's all custom. And I said to them, if you stay that every project is pure custom, you're going to have way too much complexity. You're never going to improve your profit margins, and you will reach a point past which it is very difficult to scale. The most successful companies have found ways to standardize what they do. But David, we offer a custom solution. I said, okay, but what's the standard process through which you deliver, scope out and deliver that custom solution? So there are ways to do that. I mean, you look at one of the largest, most successful consulting companies in the world, McKinsey. McKinsey has a very defined process that they do to scope out and actually take on a consulting contract with a new customer, a new client. And they are very successful for it. And they might do engagements that might be $1 million. They might be $10 or $20 million engagements or even more. But they have a consistent process for it. So imagine what the average person does. The average business owner that has a company that's, let's say, $4 million per year in revenue. And everything they do, they approach it where it's custom, built to suit. And having all this custom stuff just does not work well. You have no ability to really improve margins and to start getting scale by having some repetition with that part. So we look at how do we take what's custom and how do we make parts of it standardized? For example, can we standardize your sales process? Maybe you do sell a custom solution, but can your sales process be standardized? How about the process for how you scope out this custom work? So for example, if you were a builder, the process by which you do your design before you do a new home addition, could you standardize that? How you do that part of it? Could you standardize out how you do the production of your business? Can you standardize out how you do the HR function of your business? Can you standardize out how you do the collections portion of your business? The more that you can simplify your business, the better. The single biggest reason why people don't or struggle with doing this, they struggle to do this, generally speaking, is because they think that if I can sell a larger spread of products or services, if I can have a larger spread, that my business will be able to grow sales. So for example, that IT consulting company, they might really do their best work in the specific niche that we'll call, tech stack A. That might be in the world of Salesforce or the world of a particular type of server environment or some specific niche. And this might be the place where they do the most profitable, best work. But because they think that I want more business and they get opportunities in other areas, they spread out in their service offering and now serve other clients or customers that they probably should not be serving. And because of that, it becomes harder to standardize. And so what we tell someone like that is, look, you're not going to get rid of everybody else because you might need the revenue today. But we're going to double down in all of our marketing. We're going to double down in all of our outreach and our sales to give much more energy and attention to the part of the market that we can standardize in. We're going to grow Stack A faster and better so that as we grow Stack A, what it allows us to do is to shrink the other parts of the business. And there will reach a point in time where you get to start eliminating other offerings that no longer make sense for you to carry. Either the margins of those offerings don't make sense or the complexity doesn't make sense. And when you do this, what it does is it gives you a much more simplified business. And again, the fear people have is they say, if I were to narrow my scope of who I serve and what we do for them, they're afraid that they won't be able to generate more revenue. The irony is, and again, this comes from coaching 1,000+ companies, that to grow larger, oftentimes you have to niche narrower. I'll say that again. To grow larger, oftentimes you have to niche narrower. That can be into a particular geography, a particular product or service offering, to a particular type of customer or to a particular vertical of that. Sometimes by narrowing and creating this constraint that way, we actually make it easier for us to grow bigger. So if the first limiting factor for scaling past the $10 million barrier was owner reliance, the second was complexity. Part of complexity comes from trying to serve too many people with too many things. But another way that complexity shows or rears its ugly head is what I'll call the handyman. The handyman. We'll use that there. And I'm laughing because in my household, I am probably the world's worst handyman. My wife fixes anything that needs to be fixed, or she'll work with a repair person to get it done. She knows that I'm not really particularly handy. Now, it's a joke inside of our household about that. But the problem with a handyman is a handyman approaches things and they find a way to make it work, even if it's a little jerry-rigged or ugly with it, versus someone who really is truly coming at this like a contractor, someone whose professional business is this way. And I'll give an example. Imagine you've been in a house and the wiring for the house was done by the owner kind of rigging it together. And so the switch that you go over to turn it on should work with the light right next to it, but it actually works for the light over here. And you have all this weird stuff going on that creates complexity. The same thing happens in a business. The owner, what he or she does when they're a handyman, is they put together a solution that works, but it only works at a smaller volume or less pressure. When you take systems that worked for you and your company when you were at $2 million per year in revenue, and now you push them to a company that's doing $5 million or even $7 million, you start to spring leaks. Those systems no longer work at the larger pressures, the higher volumes that are going through it. And so what it requires is your ability to find ways to simplify not just one isolated thing, but to simplify the whole. And I'll give a great example for it. One of our clients had that spread going on in his business. He had a company that was doing fireplaces and inserts for commercial and residential houses for fireplaces. And he had built a very successful business around this, but he carried thousands of products in his stores and online, which made it very complex for somebody to sell this, which means that every time he hired a new salesperson, it might take him over a year to train the salesperson. But when he did the analysis, he discovered that there was fewer than 100 products that represented 70 or 80% of his revenue. So what he decided to do was to narrow and get rid of more than half of what he offered before, narrowing it down and changing the way he presented solutions, so that rather than selling lots of small little things, he sold kits and collections of things that work together, so that it made it much easier for a customer to not be overwhelmed with choice. It made it much easier for a salesperson to sell his products. It made it much easier for him to train a new salesperson. And lo and behold, by simplifying the business, he actually created a better, more scalable company for him to have. So again, we've got to deal with owner reliance. We've got to deal with complexity. We've got to simplify through. I'll share one more piece with that in terms of complexity, and it comes from owners who I'll call self-taught. A lot of business owners don't realize that the way they've come to learn to do their business represents the very best of their thinking. And you know what? In their best of their thinking, there's probably a portion of it that is truly really good, a portion that they've learned really well. And there's probably a portion of what their thinking is that really is kind of so-so. It works, but it's not best in practice. But there's a portion that if only they can learn a better way to go about it, would really make their business much more profitable, much more durable, much more scalable. And because they only know this narrow slice, they'll never see this other part that's there. Reinventing a wheel doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'll give two quick examples for it. Let's take the area of CRMs. I can't tell you the number of clients over the last 25 years that I've seen that can't wait to share with me their custom CRM that they built. And they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building out the CRM. And I look at it and I say, well, you know what? This is good. But why did you build custom? Well, I had functions I couldn't get out of Salesforce or Zoho CRM or Keep or HubSpot or some other marketing or sales CRM. And I said to him, well, first of all, I don't know that that's true, but I do know because you built this all custom, you now are trapped in the cycle of having to keep it updated every year and to actually kind of keep working with upgrades. And right now, what you're spending 6 figures on a year for probably 10 cents on the dollar, you could have a much better solution with very little or no energy by just buying an off-the-shelf solution that you could come into and pay a monthly fee for, right? And I smile because I can remember 20 years ago in an earlier company that I've since sold, we built a custom CRM and a custom email marketing platform. All the things that we could have gotten a few years later from multiple different platforms for about 1/100th of the cost of what we paid to develop it from scratch. And I see clients still make those mistakes. I see them making another example mistake that they make is they try to figure out, for example, their own in-house training program on an area of their business that's not their most important area of the business. Maybe it's customer service, or maybe it's on sales skills, or maybe it's on, and pick the topic for it. It requires a huge investment of energy to truly develop something that's market beating, special, that differentiates your business. And I hope your business has them. But you probably are only going to have those in 2, maybe 3 areas. Inside of Maui Mastermind, if I look at all the things where we have the places where we have good processes, procedures, systems, etc., the 3 systems that we built that matter the most to our company, the system for how we find and onboard and train great coaches who can coach the Maui way. By far, probably the most important ingredient for Secret Sauce. The second is the actual system itself that clients follow to get a superb result in a consistently excellent fashion. And the third is actually our sales process for how we go about bringing on a new client. Those are our 3 places of Secret Sauce. Other places that we do things, it doesn't have to be us developing something new or different, right? I don't need to be the one training our operations team about how they can take our current systems and leverage better technology to make them go better. We shouldn't be the one doing that. I should be bringing in other outside experts to help us to do these things. Because almost always, if it's important enough, then it's worth the investment to a third party for that. Again, in your business, you probably have 2, maybe 3 areas where your secret sauce matters so much that you should be the one who creates from scratch or hyper customizes an off-the-shelf solution. But in 85% of your business, you should be buying or renting or leasing services that are already out there. For example, if your expertise is not on the how to use ads through pay-per-click and or social media ads, you shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. You're better off probably either hiring that skill in or hiring that skill through a third-party company, right? You don't need to create that from scratch. Now, if what you do has some unique twist to it that really is your secret sauce, then by all means do that. But tying it together, those companies that scale past $10 million reliably, they've found the 2 or 3 places that they really done something custom. But then they've gone beyond the limitations of self-taught. For example, we were working with a company that was somewhere about 25, 30 million a year in revenue, maybe a little bit higher than that. And they had hit a constraint point. And they wanted to create from scratch a system to align their leadership team around a certain set of priorities every quarter and to create an accountability structure to make their company more successful. And I challenged them. I said, look, you can build this from scratch, right? Your COO is out there trying to build this from scratch. Why would you bother? You're a client of ours. We have the accountability system for exactly this. It's already done. You're just not using this piece that we have for you. Let us train your people on the quarterly focusing and alignment in terms of strategic priorities, the quarterly planning process. Let us train your team about how to create accountability structures through the Big Rock report. Let us train your team about how to use the Maui app that has this functionality. Let us train your team about the quarterly review process that's built into the app. And lo and behold, when we can do that for a client, they get a better result with a fraction of the investment of time and money. So going back to this for you, what should you build custom and what should you borrow from other sources or buy or access other people's solutions that has great ROI that you don't have to develop from scratch? All right, summing this all up, if you want to be part of that 1% scaling past $10 million, you first have to deal with owner reliance. We've given you in this episode a simple procedure for reducing owner reliance and increasing strategic depth. Second, as we said, we have to deal with complexity. We have to simplify the business. The most important place to simplify the business at first is to actually narrow the focus to serve a more narrow band, but to serve a greater number in that narrow band. We also talk about the handyman syndrome there and how do you avoid that, and the limitations of self-taught, that you really should create your secret sauce, but that 80% of your business or more is not secret sauce. So you should put your best energies to create your secret differentiators, but the other peripheral parts, you should borrow and or buy or access the very best versions of that you can afford that will give great ROI, but off the shelf. Maybe with some slight customization, but typically off the shelf. And when you do this, you free up an extraordinary amount of attention and money and time to continue to scale and grow the business to 12 million, to 22 million, to 42 million and beyond. So again, to break that $10 million barrier, these are the two hurdles you need to deal with. You now have the steps to take from that. In closing here, I want you to pick one concrete idea from this week's episode of the podcast. What's one thing you can take from today and put it into practice over the course of this quarter in your business? Write it down. Don't wait for your memory to say, I'll remember it. No, put it down. Write it down. Share it with your key staff members. Let them know what your insight was. Perhaps even have them listen or watch this episode of the podcast. Get their take on that. If you want to start accelerating the process past the $10 million barrier, that means it can't just be you. It's you plus your key leaders on this journey together. Thank you for being part of the Maui community. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you got a lot from this week's episode, and I'll see you next week, everybody. Bye-bye.